What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, I want to show you a crazy game that was just played today on January 9th, 2025 between Daniel Naroditsky and Magnus Carlsen. And in this game, Magnus plays a very rare line of the Scandinavian Defense. This game was insane. You don't want to miss it. All right, in the game, Daniel opens 1e4 as he often does. He's a 1e4 specialist, so no surprise there. But here on move 1, Magnus, instead of going, say, e5, c5, e6, c6, or any of the main lines, he does go d5, the Scandinavian Defense, and this move is a shocker. I mean, it is very rare at the highest level. You really only play this as black when you want to disrespect your opponent on move 1, and that seems to be what he's doing here. All right, Daniel continues the main line. E takes d5, then queen takes, then knight to c3, bringing out the knight and pressuring that queen on d5. Now, where does that queen want to go? Of course, you do have to move it. The main line is queen to a5. The queen does stay relatively active on the a5 square, but instead in this game, Magnus goes queen d6, and this move again is even more rare. Now, the queen on d6 is relatively active, but it's also very vulnerable. White may be able to go bishop f4 later in the game, targeting it, and it may have to move again. All right, for now, both sides do follow the main line. d4, knight f6, knight f3. So far, very standard stuff. And now here, black has a wide variety of options. You can go a6, intending a fast b5 advance. c6 is very common. You can also go, say, bishop f5 or bishop g4. And finally, you can go either g6 or e6, intending a fast bishop e7 or bishop g7, then short castle. So as you can see, black can play almost anything he wants here. Now, in the game, Magnus did go a6. That is one of the main lines for black. The point being, you want to go for a very fast b5 advance. And of course, you also do gain control of that b5 square. That b5 square is very important. Now, knight b5 and bishop b5 ideas for white are out of the question. Now here, white, his main move is g3, intending bishop g2, fianchettoing that bishop and putting pressure on the long diagonal before black can go b5 and bishop b7. That would be the strongest line. But instead here, Daniel plays a move that kind of shocked me. He plays the move h3. Now, what is the idea behind this move? It really doesn't do a whole lot. After all, if black wants to go b5, the whole point is to go bishop b7. Therefore, gaining control of g4, stopping bishop g4 ideas doesn't make a whole lot of sense, as black isn't even intending that move in the first place. So here, white is basically egging black on. He's like, please, black, please go b5. I beg you, Magnus, play the move. And Magnus says, all right, if you want me to, no problem. b5 is the move. And here, Daniel shows his idea. He wants to go a4, gaining space on the queen side, but this move turns out to be a little bit dubious. After all, here, black can just go b4, gaining space, driving back that knight on c3, and that is what Magnus does. b4 is the move. That is the strongest move in this position. Now the knight has to go somewhere, and no matter where it goes, say, I don't know, e2, b1, or a2, none of those squares inspire a lot of confidence. Now, the computer likes b1 the best, but again, all these squares don't look very attractive to me, and overall, black here is doing just fine. All right, in the game, knight e2 was played by Daniel. The idea being he potentially wants to go bishop f4, and f4 would be covered by the knight. Therefore, bishop f4 does activate that bishop. It does pressure the queen, and maybe after that, white has that h2 square for the bishop later in the game. So we're starting to kind of see the idea by Daniel here, but overall, black is doing just fine. Now here, Magnus does go bishop b7. Of course, that is the idea behind b5. And again, Magnus is doing perfectly fine here. All right, Daniel, he continues. Bishop f4, pressuring that queen on d6. Where is the queen going to go? Of course, you can't block it with, say, e5, as then you lose the pawn immediately. Therefore, the queen does have to move. But again, the question, where does it want to go? You can go to d8, d7, e6, maybe even b6. In the game, queen d8, chosen by Magnus. The queen going to d5, then d6, and then back to its original square, d8. So the queen looking a little bit strange so far in this game. All right, now here, Daniel, he continues. Knight to g3, developing his knight, very solid. Black goes e6, opening up this line of attack for the bishop, maybe intending bishop d6. We'll have to wait and see what Magnus does. Now bishop d3, and sure enough, bishop d6 chosen by Magnus in this game, challenging the white bishop on f4. Now, if white takes on d6, black is going to be doing just fine. And here he does do that. So bishop takes and then c takes. And again, black is doing perfectly fine here. And now both sides do castles. So castles castles, and then rook d1 for Daniel. A very typical 1e4 move, getting the rook onto the open, or the semi-open e-file, a very good move. Now here, Magnus, in this position, his best move is going to be a5, clamping down on the queen side. It is very important to stop the idea of a5 from white. If white gets that a5 move in, then those pawns on a6 and b4 will be disconnected. That will be very important, and overall, those pawns will be very, very weak. So overall, a5 is the best way to proceed. You can also go for other moves like, say, d5, bishop takes f3, rook a7, and so on. But the move played by Magnus in the game is actually very, very weak. He goes knight b d7, and Magnus here still blitzing out his moves. He's only wasted 20 seconds so far on the clock versus the 22 seconds of Daniel. But this move, knight b d7, allows the move a5. Daniel does play it. a5 is the move, and this idea is very thematic in the anti-martial attack in the Roy Lopez, where white goes 8a4, if you know what I'm talking about. White goes 8a4, black goes b4. Then white often goes a5 immediately, disconnecting those pawns on a6 and b4, just as we have in this game. And now both the pawn on a6 will be weak. White can go, say, queen e2, targeting it later. And the pawn on b4 will be weak. Perhaps, rook a4 or queen d2 could target it later in the game. All right, here, Magnus, he continues. h6, guarding that g5 square. A decent move, I suppose. Now knight d2 by Daniel, intending perhaps knight e4, knight c4, or something else. Now we have the move queen to c7 for Magnus, knight d to e4, and now the knights do trade. Knight takes, and then rook f to c8. Magnus piling up a lot of pressure on that pawn on c2. Of course, right now it is defended by the bishop on d3, but later in the game that could be a big deal. And Magnus here is showing his hand. He wants to go rook f c8, maybe rook a to b8, getting the rooks onto the best squares b8 and c8. All right, now Daniel continues queen to e2, getting his queen off the back reg, perfectly fine. And now Magnus, queen to c6, a very dangerous move. The point being, if this knight ever moves off e4, say white goes, I don't know, knight to g3. Didn't happen in the game. Let's say he did, though. Knight g3. Then queen takes g2 would literally be checkmate on the spot. The g2 square is smothered by the queen. The king gets checkmated. Therefore, way back here, queen to c6 is a very dangerous move, especially in blitz. Daniel will have to respect that threat for the rest of the game. So here, Daniel, he plays a very cheeky move, queen to f1, retreating the queen back to the f1 square. Typically, you see the bishop on that square, but here is the queen, and the point being, the queen does cover g2 preemptively. That way, moves like f5 will not win the knight. Way back here, if white doesn't respect that, f5 is actually being threatened, and again, if the knight moves back to g3, that would be checkmate. So here, a move like queen f1 is actually forced to defend that knight on the e4 square and stop it from getting just eliminated from the board. All right, now here, Magnus, he's got a lot of options here. You can go, say, rook a b8, queen c7, or so on. In the game, though, he did play the move queen d5, marching up with his queen and putting some pressure on that pawn on d4. I quite like this move. Magnus being very active so far in this game. All right, Daniel, how is he going to defend that pawn on d4 while respecting the threat of, say, queen takes g2, f5, and so on? Well, in the game, he does go c3. This turns out to be maybe the best response, but it looks a little bit ugly at first glance. After all, black can take on c3 and then actually take with the rook. Rook takes c3. The point being that rook on c3 is not hanging. The point being black can take on c3, and then that pawn on c3 will be very, very weak later in the game. So b takes c3 played, then b takes c3, and now here Magnus finds a brilliant move, simply f5, removing the defender of that pawn on c3. As soon as the knight moves, then c3 will fall. All right, now here, Daniel, where should the knight go? Well, in the game, knight d2 chosen by Daniel. It turns out knight g3 may have been a little bit stronger according to the computer. And now we have, of course, rook takes c3, flying in, winning that pawn on c3. And now here, Magnus is temporarily up a single pawn. However, there is a very simple tactic to win back a pawn essentially immediately. And if you like puzzles, again, pause the video right now and try to find the way for Daniel to try and equalize the game, equalize the material count immediately. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. Seriously, helps me out a ton. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, the key idea for Daniel, of course he finds it, is bishop to c4, lining up the bishop with his pawn on e6 and the king on g8. things are getting very dangerous. All right, now here, Magnus takes yet another pawn, that being the pawn on d4. Queen takes d4 is the move, showing the idea behind queen c6, then queen d5 earlier in the game. But now we have bishop takes e6 check, hits the king. The king is going to have to move. There's no way to block the check. So king to h8. Now the knight on d7 and the knight on d2 are both hanging, and those two knights do come flying off. So bishop takes d7, queen takes d2, and then the move to win back the material. Bishop takes f5, and now the material in this game is even. Both sides do have 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4 for black as well. Now we have a very crazy position where the game is opening up. Both sides have the queen, the 2 rooks, and those light squared bishops. And the key factor in this game is going to be king safety. Who can create threats against the opponent's king faster? That will be the big deciding factor here. And overall, Magnus may be in a little bit better of a position. Of course, the bishop on b7 targeting g2 is a little bit better for black than for white. And black can apply a lot of pressure, say, a fast rook f8, and he's going to have a lot of pressure on that f2 pawn. So overall, I am liking black a little bit better here. All right, in the game, rook f8 play by Magnus. A very obvious move here, putting pressure on the bishop on f5. Where is it going to go? Well, before moving it here, Daniel does go rook a d1, applying pressure on the queen on d2. Now, Magnus, queen to f4, retreats the queen, and very importantly, hits the bishop again, and again applies a lot of pressure on that pawn on f2. Things are already getting very, very dangerous. Now here, it turns out the strongest defensive move is just bishop to b1, keeping the bishop safe and on this diagonal here, setting up future queen d3 ideas if that rook on c3 does move. So overall, bishop b1 would be the right way to continue. But instead here, Daniel plays the move rook to e7, ignoring the threat on the bishop, but instead counterattacking on both g7 and that hanging bishop on b7. However, this turns out to be a very big mistake, as you can see by the eval bar kind of collapsing in favor of Magnus after this move rook to e7. Again, the eval bar just skyrocketing down. And here, Magnus has a wide variety of moves. It turns out you can just take that bishop. Queen takes or rook takes are both good. But beyond that, here, Magnus has the just unthinkable move that's maybe even stronger than the alternatives, bishop to f3. Now, this wasn't played in the game, but I do want to show you. The point being, the bishop is lost anyway, so you just sacrifice it on f3. The point being, if white takes the bishop, then rook takes f5, intending perhaps rook g5 would be just extremely deadly. So, bishop f3 is a very scary option here. Instead, in the game, Magnus did play the simpler option, queen takes f5, winning the free bishop. Now, of course, Daniel will take back on b7, rook takes b7, and now we have sort of an endgame, middle game position with the queen and the 2 rooks for both sides. All the major pieces are left on the board. This will get very, very dangerous, as those major pieces are very dangerous. All right, now here, queen takes a5 is the move for Magnus, winning the free pawn on a5. Now, rook takes d6, winning back that pawn as well, and now queen to c5, pressuring the rook on d6. All right, rook b d7 was chosen by Daniel Naroditsky, doubling up rooks on the d file. They are defending each other just fine, and now rook to c2, applying more and more pressure on that pawn on f2. Now it is being attacked 3 times by the 2 rooks and the queen. Can Daniel defend? He goes rook d2, trying to defend, blocking off the attack of the rook on c2 on the pawn. Therefore, he's defending for now. And now we have rook c1 for Magnus, putting pressure on the queen on f1. Now, rook d1 is forced. That is the only way to save the queen. Otherwise, the queen is pinned to the king on g1. So rook d1 blocks the attack. Now we have rook takes, and the key move a5. Magnus with the passed pawn on a5, the passed alpha 0 a pawn. His plan is very, very simple. He wants to push that pawn down the board as quickly as he can at all costs. All right, now here we have the move rook to c1, hits the queen on c5, has to move queen to a7, chosen in the game, then queen to e2, sliding off the back rank, and now here Magnus shows again his plan, simply pushing the pawn down the board with a4, rook c2, and then a3. Again, that pawn is getting dangerous. Now, queen to e6, the queen and the rook do guard a2, therefore a2 is not possible yet. Magnus goes queen d4, jumping up with the queen. Then we have king to h2, rook to a8, and now, of course, a2 is being threatened potentially, so rook a2 blockades that pawn. Now, queen to c5, jumping up with the queen. Queen to b3, dropping back. Queen to e5, hits the king on the h2 square. g3 blocks the attack. Then queen to c5, again defending that pawn on a3. Now, it looks like both sides are sort of in a stalemate. White can't take the pawn. Black can't move the pawn. But of course, here, Magnus, he has 40 seconds left on the clock versus the 19 of Daniel. Magnus will be trying to press for a win here. All right, queen to f3 is the move, sliding over. Rook f8 hits the queen, queen e2, queen d4, and now we have the move h4 for Daniel, gaining space on the king side. Now queen c3, king g2, rook b8, rook c2, queen to f6, queen to c4, rook b2, sliding down with the rook. This is getting dangerous for Daniel. Of course, if you take, then say a takes b2 would win on the spot, as there's almost no way to stop that pawn. So queen to c8 chosen in the game, king to h7, and now it turns out rook takes b2 is actually the right move. Instead, in the game, queen to c4 chosen, queen to c4, and this is a critical mistake. It turns out here Magnus has a move, as you can see by the eval bar collapsing here. He has a winning option here. And again, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the winning move here for Magnus. All right, the winning move is the move a2, just pushing the pawn. What is the idea? Well, of course, if you take the pawn with the queen, you lose the queen. And if you take the rook on b2, you just go a1, promoting to a queen. And you have two queens versus the queen and rook. And you would effectively win on the spot. Instead, in the game, rook takes c2 chosen by Magnus. Magnus missing the idea in time pressure. Then we have queen takes c2, winning back and hitting the king with check. And of course, Magnus will still have winning chances here, as he still has that alpha 0a pawn. All right, queen g6, blocking the attack. Of course, if you trade queens, queen takes, then the king is outside the square of the pawn. That means the pawn would promote onto the a1 square, winning the game. So instead, queen b3 chosen by Daniel, then queen c6 hits the king. The king must move. King to h2, queen to a8, sliding back with the queen. Queen to a2, blocking the advance of the pawn. King to h8, sliding back. h5, queen to a5, queen to f7, queen to e5, again sliding over with the queen. Then queen to b3, queen takes h5, wins that pawn with check. King to g1 and queen to c5 defends the pawn. Now, Magnus is simply up a single pawn. He smells blood. He's going to press for a win at all costs. All right, queen b8 hits the king. King to h7, queen b1, king h8, king h7, queen b8 hits the king again. Queen to f8 blocks the attack. Then we have queen b3, king to h8, and here in this position, Daniel, the two best moves are queen to a4 and queen to a2 defending. Instead, in the game, the move is queen to d3. This move is a critical mistake, and here Magnus just goes a2, punishing the mistake of not having the queen guard that a2 square from either a4 or a2, and now again the pawn is threatening to promote. All right, queen to a6 chosen in the game by Daniel. Queen to s7, queen a8, king a7, queen e4, g6 blocking the attack, queen to a4 sliding over, guarding that pawn on a2, stopping a1, and now we have h5 just gaining space on the king side. Magnus here, his goal, he has to find a way to get his king outside of the danger zone of the queen where it can't be hit with checks. All right, king g2, queen d5 hits the king, f3, queen to f7 retreats the queen, king h3, king g7, queen a3, queen f5 hits the king again, king h2, queen c2, king h3, and here Magnus, he actually throws away his advantage with a very simple mistake. He goes queen to b1, but again, this is a mistake. Instead, queen to c4 or the move queen to f5 are the right ways forward. Now, queen b1, what is the problem with this move? It's simple. Queen to e7 forces a draw on the spot. I do want to show this. Queen e7, and here, what is Magnus to do? If he goes back with the king, say, I don't know, king to h8, then queen to f8, and then we have basically a draw by repetition. Instead, if you go for the move king to h6, then queen to f8 again forces the king back, and you have this draw by repetition going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Instead, if you make the mistake of going king to g5, then f4 is actually checkmate on the spot. So overall, queen to e7 in this position would force a draw by repetition, or a checkmate if black doesn't respect the threat. Instead, king to h4 played in the game by Daniel, a big mistake. And here, a1 promoting to a queen. It turns out that does win on the spot. Instead, queen to g1 played by Magnus. Again, Magnus missing that idea. And Daniel, he's down to less than 1 second on the clock, as you can see by his clock essentially disappearing. And now here, queen to c3 is the right defensive move. Instead, king to g5 played in the game, a big mistake. And here it turns out Magnus has a simple checkmate in one move. That is the move queen g3. Queen g3 would literally be checkmate. Instead, in the game, Magnus plays a blunder, but the blunder wins on the spot. He plays the move queen to e3, not a move Daniel expected. And here the problem is, white can simply take the queen. Queen takes e3, and if he had enough time to find that, followed by, say, queen to e7, white would be winning in this position. But the problem is white ran out of time. So Magnus here playing a disrespectful move, ignoring the checkmate in one, instead going queen to e3, forking the queen and the king, not a move that white expected, forcing queen takes e3, but Daniel with less than 1 second left on the clock, he couldn't find it, and he lost on time to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a crazy game between Daniel Naroditsky and Magnus Carlsen from this blitz game played on January 9th, 2025. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this other video right here where I cover yet another one of Magnus Carlsen's latest games against Daniel Naroditsky. That was played, I believe, on the 6th or the 7th of January of this year. That one was also wild. So check that one out, and I'll see you in the next video.